10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 214. Hey everybody, welcome back to episode 214 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. My name is Nick Manella. I'm the creator and host of this show. If you are brand new, welcome in. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy out there. Before we jump into the show, I wanted to give a quick shout out to our new Patreon supporters that have signed up this week. And they're doing so in the form of a $3 donation every single month. And that gets them access to all the PDFs we put out on the show, along with occasional other benefits that will help you with your jazz improvisation. So thank you to Colin, Kyotaro, and Rob for signing up this week. We really appreciate it. If you're somebody who would like to support us on Patreon because you see some value in this podcast and want to make sure it keeps coming at you, then go to our website, 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, get yourself signed up, and you get instant access to all those materials. We are a listener-supported show. That is how we stay in business. So for anybody that's thinking about that and chooses to sign up, we thank you. All right, so let's get into today's episode. So as I mentioned in last week's episode, we're going to continue with our listener questions this month. So we're going to be doing some different topics in lieu of one series that lasts for the entire month. And this week's topic is going to come from a discussion that we had in the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson community Facebook group about tunes. And there's sort of some various topics around this, but I think we're going to aim this in the direction of how to categorize tunes. And I think that will help with, first of all, memorizing tunes and keeping them memorized. And second of all, if you're working on a specific topic and you know a bunch of tunes that fall into these various categories, it will be easier for you to work on said topic and find a tune that will work with the concept you are practicing. So this discussion was started by Barb, and I really appreciate this, and then a lot of other people chimed in with some sort of clarifying statements on how an episode like this would benefit them. So I'm going to try to cover as much ground as possible, but this is a really big topic, so you'll have to forgive me if I'm sort of skirting around what you wanted me to talk about, but I'm trying to make this into something that I can talk about in an intelligent way and hopefully give you some advice that you can actually use. So if you have any other questions, just again, let's continue this discussion in the community group, and I'd be happy to do other episodes where I address more of what you're wondering about. Okay, hopefully that all made sense. But what I've done is I've prepared a PDF with some guidelines for how to approach jazz standards and hopefully start to categorize them in a way that will make sense. So we're going to start with some broad categories of tunes, and then we're going to move into a few more specific characteristics of tunes that will hopefully help you to categorize this stuff into a way that when you're on stage and somebody calls a tune and you know it, but you can't bring it to the top of your mind right away, I'm really hoping that this will help. Or if you're about to learn a new tune and you think, geez, I'm never going to remember this after I learn it, hopefully this might help you to throw it into sort of a bucket or a category that will give it some defining characteristic that will allow you to remember it long term. Because we've all had that experience where we go through, we memorize a tune, and then at the end of a week or so, we go, oh yeah, I got this tune down. I can play it perfectly. I can improvise over it. And then we move away from that tune, and when somebody calls it a month later, you've suddenly forgotten it. because you don't remember anything about the tune enough to play it. And this really becomes a concern the more and more tunes that you memorize, because as your brain gets more full of information, it's much easier to forget one single tune. When you only know 10 tunes, it's really easy to remember all 10 of those tunes. When you know 200 tunes, it's really, really difficult to stay on top of that and make sure that you remember everything about one of 200 as opposed to one of 10. So hopefully some of these categories and examples may help some of you out there. All right, so we're going to go from really broad categories into more specific characteristics of tunes, and this is all written on the PDF along with examples, so you can grab that when you get your PDF this week. So here's some broad categories that I use. The first one is time signature. That one is very, very obvious, but that is a bucket that I put my tunes into, because sometimes on a gig, you realize, oh, geez, I've played only tunes that are in 4/4 for this entire gig. Let's play something in 3. So then my mind immediately goes into my 3/4 category. What tunes do I know that are in the time signature of 3/4? And then certain tunes come to mind, and I can reach for some of my favorite tunes that are in that time signature. Second thing would be style, right? So whether it's a swing tune, whether it's a bossa nova, whether it's a more modern style, straight eighth, I'm thinking about several different styles, and that helps me on gigs too. Because if I realize, oh, geez, all I've done is swing tunes, let's do something that's in a bossa nova style or a straight eighth modern style, then I can go into that bucket. Now, granted, these buckets, they're very, very, very broad, right? That's a huge bucket of tunes, bossa nova versus swing. The swing category being the largest bucket of tunes, but at least it gives me somewhere to go. Now, the third broad category would be the tempo. Is it a ballad? Is it medium? Or is it up-tempo? And there are shades of gray in all of this, right? Because as far as medium tempo goes, that's something you're going to have to define for yourself. That's a broad category of tempos. Same thing with up-tempo, depending on, what you consider up-tempo and what tempos you can play at. That could be a huge, huge range of tunes there. But again, that's why we're calling these broad categories, right? Because they have less defining characteristics and are more broadly fitting into these different things. All right, so now we're moving into more specific characteristics. So another thing that I think of that really helps me is the length of the form. So I've listed 4 lengths that I think are really a great place to start. So 16 bars, that is a very common length of form. 24 bars, another very common length of tune that you see. 32 bars might be the most common length of tune. And then the fourth one is kind of the, odd one out if it has an odd number of bars. So a tune like All the Things You Are is something that I consider to be a weird form, right? It's 36 measures. That's very strange. It takes the 32 bar form and it puts a 4 bar extension on the end of it. That is a very defining characteristic for that tune. You'll see tunes with 20 measure forms, kind of all over the place, but I will immediately put that into that category. Now you'll notice I left out like 12 bars because that's pretty clearly going to be a defining characteristic on its own, which is the blues. 9 times out of 10, if you have a 12 bar form, it's going to be some kind of blues. So I left that out because blues is kind of its own category, and I think most of us know that that is the defining characteristic of that form, is that it's the blues. Now, another thing that goes hand in hand with the length is how the form is set up, meaning is it AABA? Is it ABCD? Is it ABAC? Is it AB, right? I mean, there's so many different things. So this could be another thing that you could go through and you could figure out and put them in that bucket. You have a bucket for AABA tunes. You have a bucket for AB tunes. And then you can further delineate those by the length of the form. So the length of the form and the structure of the tune in terms of sections really can help you. This might be one of the biggest things that will help you categorize the tunes and also start to see some patterns within the tunes. And that's going to be the big thing that's going to help you when you're trying to recall a tune right before you play it, is if you can come up with a few defining characteristics of the tune. Most of the time, the entire progression will kind of come flooding back into your brain. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So these are specific characteristics that really, really help me remember how a tune works. So one thing is, does the tune have a bridge? I think that is something I think about all the time, because a bridge can really be a defining characteristic of a tune. And where does that bridge modulate to? Right? Because the definition of a bridge is that some kind of modulation is happening that bridges the other sections of the tunes. That's why we call it a bridge. So one of the most common places that the bridge goes to is the key of the 4, right? That is a bucket of tunes that I think about all the time. The bridge goes to the 4. Does the bridge go to the relative major or the relative minor? That's another thing that happens all the time. Or does it go somewhere else? And that's even another bucket of tunes. Now, it doesn't always just have to be the bridge that's the defining characteristic. Like, I'm thinking of Cole Porter's I Love You. That tune modulates to the key of the major 3 right before it goes to the bridge. So the bridge in that case is not the defining characteristic to me. It's this really strange thing that happens right before the bridge that really reminds me of how that tune goes and is one of the defining characteristics. Now, here's another one. Does the tune move through different keys in a way that is predictable or unpredictable? So for instance, here's a tune that's in 3/4, so it fits into that bucket. Usually it's played in a medium tempo, so it fits into that bucket. It's swing, and it's a 24 measure form. And the tune that I'm talking about is Bluesette. So do you see how I moved through all those categories and gave it all of those characteristics? Now I really have a clear picture of this tune in my mind. But back to what we were talking about. So is this a chord progression that makes sense? Yes. What it does is it moves down by whole steps using 2-5-1 progressions. That in my mind is very predictable. So that can become another defining characteristic. And if I know that the entire form is based off of that, keys moving down in whole steps, then I can recall that instantly when somebody else calls that tune and I have that moment of panic. I don't remember what's going on. And then all those characteristics that I assigned to this tune to help me memorize it come flooding back into my brain. And all of a sudden, I know what's going on. So an example of an unpredictable chord progression would be something like giant steps, right? I mean, those are very unpredictable modulations in that tune. That's the reason that the tune is cool, is it goes to places that are unpredictable. Going back to Cole Porter's I Love You, that would be an instance of going to a very unpredictable place. A predictable place for the bridge to go would be the 4 chord. That happens in hundreds and thousands of tunes. An unpredictable place would be the major 3rd. That doesn't make as much sense. It's very much more striking to the ear and makes me think a little bit harder, to be quite honest with you. So hopefully I'm kind of showing you how I whittle down the tunes to ultimately remind me of how a tune goes. But now, 13 minutes into this podcast, let's get to the heart of the matter, because I think what Barb was really asking is, she wants to know how to be able to apply certain concepts, and we're going to do a whole episode on that. But here's my short answer, is by doing everything that I've been talking about for the past 13 minutes, you start to really be able to recognize what's going on in a tune much more quickly. You start to, by analyzing, using all of the strategies I've shown you, understanding where a chord progression is going, what it's based off of, how that chord progression fits into the larger form, understanding the defining characteristics of a tune will ultimately tell you what you can use over that tune, what concepts you should plug into that tune to help you through that particular chord progression. So if you realize a tune is based off of the circle of fourths, you're going to use some practice concepts, some vocabulary that's based off of the circle of fourths. If you realize that the keys are moving down in whole steps, you're going to use an exercise or a piece of vocabulary that you've learned from a transcription that moves down in whole steps. So you really have to go off of what the tune is presenting to you to figure out what you should put into the tune, what concepts you should be working on over that particular tune. Let the tune dictate what you're working on. And after a while, what happens is you know enough tunes and you have enough of these tune buckets that you can always find the perfect tune for whatever concept you're working on. Because in your mind, you go, okay, this exercise that I'm working on uses sort of this specific chord movement. I know 10 tunes that follow that same specific chord movement. But the first thing that you need to do is know a lot of tunes. Because otherwise you're working on some kind of concept and you go, I don't even know any tunes that use this concept in real life. So that's a major concern. Start learning tunes, and I think you'll find you can always find an appropriate chord progression that's going to fit the concept that you're working on. But it requires that knowledge first. It requires knowing a lot of tunes. All right, that was quite a lot of rambling. That was about 16 minutes of me talking to you guys about tunes, but it's a big topic, you know what I mean? And sometimes I hamstring myself here by calling this the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast because I feel like I can't do a longer discussion. But this is a good example of something that just needed more time. So hopefully this wasn't too long-winded, and I'm sure you guys are going to have a bunch of questions about what I was talking about in this episode. So definitely leave me a message. We'll start another discussion in the community Facebook group. But let me know if I addressed some of those people who chimed in on the thread. Let me know if I addressed your concerns, because I really do want to get to the heart of it. I'm happy to do another episode if I completely went left field from where you were thinking about this stuff. And a reminder, I will have a PDF of these different buckets that maybe you can print out, and put on your wall in your practice space so that when you're thinking about the tune that you're learning, you can look at some of those broad categories and some of those more specific categories, and hopefully that will help you in your ability to categorize some of these tunes. But let's talk about it. I'd really like to open up a discussion on this. And as I said, very happy to do another episode or multiple episodes on this topic. Very, very important. All right. Hope you guys have a great weekend. I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy out there. And we'll talk to you next week with a brand new episode. Talk to you soon. Bye.